Good morning, Unshaken Kids. Thanks for joining me back here. Can't wait until everybody gets to come back to church and we can do this all together. I'm really excited about that. Now today, of course, we're still going through the 10 Commandments. We're talking about a new commandment today. Let's see if you can figure out what it is. We're going to be talking about a guy named Judas. Now, you might have known Judas from the New Testament. He was one of Jesus's 12 disciples. Now, you know what he's most famous for, right? He betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He helped the Pharisees to arrest him and kill him. But the story we're talking about today happens way before all that happens. Now, the disciples, these 12 guys, of which Judas was one of them, were Jesus's closest friends. And they followed him around and they learned from him. But Judas had a very special job as one of the 12 disciples. He was the treasurer. Do you know what a treasurer does in any sort of club or business? The treasurer is someone who is in charge of the money. So Judas was in charge of all of the money. So when they would go to the marketplace, Judas was responsible for buying the food. When they went to the temple, Judas was in charge of giving the money for the offering. When they needed new sandals, Judas would go to the shoe store and pay the bill. When they wanted to go stay at an inn, Judas would handle the payment. Or if they needed to rent a donkey for something, guess who paid for it? That's right, Judas. But there was a small problem with Judas being the treasurer. And that was that Judas was a thief. And today's commandment is, if you didn't already guess it, do not steal. And Judas did steal from Jesus, no less. Now, the other disciples probably didn't know that Judas was doing this, but I imagine they did. If they had known, they would have been really mad and really upset at Judas, and they probably wouldn't have let him come around anymore. So in Exodus 20, verse 15, that's where we find the commandment that says, do not steal. Do not take things that don't belong to you. But our Bible story takes place in John chapter 12 today, and we're actually going to read the Bible story 2 times, and we're going to look at it from 2 different points of view. The first point of view is Judas. All right, so here we go. We're in John chapter 12. I'm going to read the first 3 verses. It says, "Then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead, there they made him supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil." Now put yourself in the mind of Judas, okay? You are always trying to get as much money as possible for yourself. What do you think that you're going to think when you see Mary pouring this very expensive oil onto Jesus' feet? His feet of all things. Well, let's see what Judas said. Verse 4 says, "But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, 'Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?'" All right, so he said, we could have taken this oil and we could have sold it and we could have given that money to the poor. Now, on the outside, that looks like Judas, was so generous and so giving and, he wants to give money to the poor. But do you think that's really what Judas wanted? Let's find out. Verse 6 says, "This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and he had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it." So we see Judas didn't care at all about giving money to the poor. He just wanted to steal some of that money for himself. Now, guys, we are not supposed to steal. When we do steal, it messes up our hearts. It makes us greedy. And we think we're just going to steal a little bit. But then the more that we get, the more that we want. And then we want more. And then we want more. Judas didn't care at all about the poor. He didn't care about wasting that perfume. He just wanted money for himself. Now let's look at that same story from Mary's point of view. We know that Judas's heart was greedy and self-centered because he was stealing money for himself. But what about Mary's heart? All right, I'm going to read verse 3 again. It says, Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. Now, while Judas's heart was focused on being greedy and getting more for himself, Mary was the opposite of that. She was generous. She took all that she had, this oil that she could have sold and fed her family or bought some new clothes with it. But instead, she gave it all to Jesus. She did the opposite of stealing. She was generous and she was giving. Now, why do you think Mary gave up this perfume? Like, did Jesus ask for it? I don't think so. Did Jesus' feet stink? And so she thought, maybe I'm just going to pour this perfume on his feet because they stink so bad? Probably not any more than anybody else's feet stunk. So why do you think she gave it to him? I think that Mary had a heart that wanted to worship the Lord and wanted to worship Jesus. And so she gave all that she had generously. Now let's read what Jesus says about what happened here. Now remember, Judas got upset with Mary and said, we could have given that to the poor. Here's what Jesus says. But let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but me you do not always have. Mary gave up expensive perfume as a generous act of worship, but you can talk to Jesus. He might be calling you to give up something that you've held on to as an act of worship to him. You know, when it comes to money and things, we can get very greedy, or we can be very generous. But God's way is always the best. And he tells us we don't steal. We don't take things that don't belong to us, like Judas did. Instead, we can be generous like Mary was. All right, I have a little object lesson for you guys. Let me just switch these. All right, so we're learning that we don't take things that don't belong to us. That's called stealing. And the Bible very specifically tells us we don't steal. And the problem is that once we start, it can be really hard to stop. Taking even one thing can lead to us doing more and more stealing, and things can get out of control really quickly. Let's imagine that all the beads in this jar are things that we really want, but they don't belong to us. Maybe like more money or a smartphone, like a new iPhone or a cool new pair of shoes or a cool new bike or someone's Xbox. You know, we think, oh, man, maybe just this once, nobody will even notice. Maybe there's some candy on my teacher's desk. Nobody's going to notice if I just take one little thing. That got out of control pretty quickly, didn't it? I just gave it one little pull, and now suddenly it's all out. That's how sin is, and that's how stealing can be. We think we're just taking one little thing, but it can get out of control so quickly. Because once the beads started coming out, there's something called momentum. And momentum can be very hard to stop. It can get out of control the way the beads just kept going and going and going. Our choices have momentum too. Choosing to steal can lead us to choosing to steal more or even other kinds of sins. We can just keep going and going until we feel out of control. And that is why we don't steal. We don't take things that don't belong to us.